Okay, so in this video, we're going to continue going through the Islamic empires in time period 4. And in this video, we're going to look at the Safavid Empire. So the Safavid Empire is Persia. So this is what's going on in Persia in time period 4. So this story is going to pick up after the Ilkhanate. So after the Mongols after the Ilkhanate in Persia, there was a bit of instability. And eventually, a Shia Islamic empire emerges from the chaos after the Ilkhanate fell apart. Now, we're going to pick this story up in the early 1500s. So the main character of this story is a child named Ishmael. Ishmael was the son of an assassinated Sufi Shia religious leader. Now, remember, the Sufis were Muslims who had this spiritual connection to God, and they fostered those kinds of relationships. So these guys were kind of mystical Muslims. They were known as good missionaries, and they spread Islam quite a bit because they were more willing to allow people to keep their previous religious practices. So this kid, Ishmael, was the son of an assassinated Sufi Shia religious leader. And he went into hiding Now, your textbook makes it seem like he did this all by himself, but really he was with his father's like bodyguards and other loyal soldiers. And when he was old enough, at 15, he reemerged and took back his homeland and began ruling. Now, this story probably sounds very familiar because it's also pretty much the same story as Genghis Khan. It's also a very similar story to Julius Caesar. So it's debatable whether or not this is actually what happened or if this is what they said happened in order for it to kind of be acceptable by the people. But in any event, this is more or less the story of the first Safavid ruler, Shah Ismail. And he names his empire after his type of Shia Islam called Safaviya Sufism. So Safaviya Sufism gives us the Safavid Empire. Now, Ismail was very aware of how he was viewed by the public, and so he needed to have a good story to back up his legitimacy. And so Ismail and his followers adopted what was called Twelver Shi'ism. Twelver Shi'ism is a branch of Shia Islam that speaks of 12 perfect imams. An imam is a religious leader. Now, of these 12 imams, the first was Ali, who you remember was one of Muhammad's closest friends. He was also the fourth caliph. The first one of these 12 perfect imams was Ali. The next 10 were persecuted and eventually killed. And the 12th one went into hiding in the 860s and was prophesied to return and spread his religion. So the Safavids kind of indirectly spread the idea that Ismail was this 12th imam. Now, they never actually came out and said it, but they never said you were wrong if you said it, and it was always kind of like a, you know what I mean kind of situation. They never directly said it. They always indirectly. They never said you were wrong if you said it. And so the idea kind of started to spread. So among the Safavids, they wore a special hat to signify their adoption of Twelver Shi'ism. And this special hat was called a Kizilbash. I think there are pictures of it in your textbook, but this hat had 12 pleats, so 12 folds in it, to represent the 12 imams. So remember back to when we first started talking about Islam, the Sunnis and Shia did not get along. And this goes back hundreds of years. And so this is represented in time period 4 in wars between the Ottomans, who were Sunni, and the Safavids, who were Shia. The Ottoman Empire was I guess nervous about this new type of Shiism spreading into the Ottoman Empire. And so they attacked the Safavids. And they won. They briefly took over the Safavid capital. But they couldn't get rid of them entirely. Later, so in the later in the time period, a different Shah, Shah Abbas the Great, is going to revitalize the Safavid Empire. And kind of bring them up to contemporary times. So he's going to incorporate gunpowder weapons, which they had neglected to do, which is probably why the Ottomans beat them. They're going to make alliances with Europeans against the Ottomans, and they're going to start winning. And they're going to start conquering territory. Mostly in Central Asia, kind of in the spaces between India and China. So we're going to hit pause here because a lot of this territory is going to be kind of up for grabs between the Indians and the Russians and then the British as we move into time period 5. So we're going to hit pause here and pick this story back up when we get into time period 5. With hitting pause here, this does give us more of an opportunity to kind of look at the nature of these Islamic empires, because they are similar in a lot of aspects. Even though they did fight each other, there are a lot of similarities between these three empires that we're looking at: the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal Empire, which we'll look at in the next video. So let's take a moment and talk about agriculture and trade. Because remember, when we started talking about these Islamic empires, we wanted to kind of think about what was the effect of European exploration and finding routes to India and the Western Hemisphere. What effects would that have on the Islamic empires? So that's the question we'll look at. So, as we've seen when we looked at East Asia, there are a lot of indirect effects. There was a lot of adoption of various cash crops, especially things like coffee and tobacco. These were very popular in the Islamic empires. Remember, though, that when we think about the European exploration during this time period, the effects are indirect. The Islamic empires were rich enough to withstand a lot of European influence. So they didn't really have to do anything yet. They were rich enough and advanced enough that the Europeans really weren't having that much of an effect on them yet. But they are doing some trade with the Europeans. And I think, as we mentioned in the previous video, the relationship has flipped. It's the Europeans who are starting to trade manufactured goods and luxury items to the Islamic empires at a very steep profit. So the Europeans begin to take advantage of their superior trade position. Now, this isn't going to be really in effect until we get into time period 5, but for right now, they're kind of beginning to take advantage of this. When it comes to the Colombian Exchange itself, we don't see as much impact here as we have elsewhere. So we don't see the massive population growth we see in Europe or in China, or the massive dip in population that we saw in the Western Hemisphere. Things kind of just stayed about even, maybe a little bit of an increase, but not as drastic a change up or down like we saw in other places. Now, there's one more topic that I'd like to turn to socially, and this is religious policy. So all three of these empires have very diverse populations. And so what we're seeing here is that Muslims are ruling many people with many religious traditions. And this is really no different than what we've seen in the past when we've talked about the caliphate. Muslims were, for the most part, very religiously tolerant. So, generally speaking, there is a policy of religious toleration. With the payment of the jizya, which was that tax on non-Muslims. So we'll see this in both the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. Not the Mughals, though, in India, because the Muslims are a minority. And we'll talk about that in our next video. And typically, if communities paid their tax, the Islamic rulers allowed them to govern themselves according to their own laws. So in the Ottoman Empire, this was called the millet system. And this is really just a continuation of what was going on during the caliphate, that if you paid your tax and you weren't being disruptive, they allowed you to practice your religion and govern yourself how you saw fit. Now, we're also going to see in these empires that shows of religious faith are important for leaders to maintain their legitimacy. So you had to show your people that you were religiously faithful. And so one relatively easy way to show this off was to build monuments to the faith. And we'll see two really important examples of this. One of these is Suleymaniye Mosque, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, in Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. So this was a mosque built to celebrate Suleiman the Magnificent, and it is just as impressive as the Hagia Sophia. Another example of this, and it's much more famous, is the Taj Mahal. In the Mughal Empire. So we will talk more about that in our last video on these Islamic empires. So in our last video, we'll talk about the Mughal Empire and how it's similar and different from the Ottomans and the Safavids. And we'll talk about why these empires started to decline, because they'll all kind of start to decline for the same reasons at roughly the same time. So we'll do that in our last video on this chapter. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.